Welcome to video number 3 for Chapter 36, The Cold War Begins. An anti-red chase was now in full force in the U.S., with the formation of the Loyalty Review Board, which investigated more than 3 million federal employees. The Attorney General also drew up a list of 90 organizations that were potentially not loyal to the U.S., and none was given the opportunity to defend itself. Fear of communism was raging in the United States. In 1949, 11 communists were brought up to a New York jury for violating the Smith Act of 1940, which had been the first peacetime anti-sedition law since 1798. They were convicted, sent to prison, and their conviction was upheld by the 1951 case, Dennis versus the United States. The House of Representatives had, in 1938, established the Committee on Un-American Activities, nicknamed HUAC, to investigate subversion, and in 1948, committee member Richard M. Nixon prosecuted a man named Alger Hiss. In February of 1950, Joseph McCarthy burst upon the scene, charging that there were scores of unknown communists in the State Department. He couldn't prove it, and many Americans began to fear that this red chase was going too far. After all, how could there be freedom of speech if saying communist ideas got one arrested? Truman vetoed the McCarran Internal Security Bill, which would have let the president arrest and detain suspicious people during an internal security emergency. The Soviet success of developing nuclear bombs so easily was probably due to spies stealing information from the United States. In 1951, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, seen here in this picture, were brought to trial, convicted, and executed of selling nuclear secrets to the Russians. Their sensational trial, electrocution, and sympathy for their 2 children began to sober American zeal in red hunting. Republicans won control of the House in 1946 and then nominated Thomas Dewey again to the 1948 ticket, while Democrats were forced to choose Truman again when war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower refused to be chosen. Truman's nomination split the Democratic Party, as Southern Democrats, who were called Dixiecrats, nominated Governor Strom Thurmond of South Carolina on a states' rights party ticket. Former Vice President Henry Wallace also threw his hat in the ring and was nominated by the New Progressive Party. With the Democrats totally disorganized, Dewey seemed destined for a super easy victory, and on election night, the Chicago Tribune even ran an early edition wrongly proclaiming Dewey defeats Truman. Truman shockingly won, getting 303 electoral votes to Dewey's 189. The Democrats won control of the Congress again as well. Truman received critical support from farmers, workers, and blacks. He then called for a new program called Point 4, which called for financial support of poor, underdeveloped lands in hope of keeping underprivileged peoples from turning communist. At home, Truman outlined a sweeping Fair Deal program, which called for improved housing, full employment, a higher minimum wage, better farm price supports, a new Tennessee Valley Authority, and an extension of Social Security. However, the only successes came in raising the minimum wage, providing for public housing in the Housing Act of 1949, and extending old age insurance to more beneficiaries with the Social Security Act of 1950. When Russian and American forces withdrew from Korea, they had left the place full of weapons and with rival regimes, Communist North Korea against Democratic South Korea. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces suddenly invaded South Korea, taking the South Koreans by surprise and pushing them dangerously south towards Busan. Truman sprang into action, remembering that the League of Nations had failed from inactivity, and ordered the U.S. military spending to be quadrupled, as desired by the National Security Council Memorandum No. 68, or NSC 68. Truman also used a Soviet absence from the UN to label North Korea as an aggressor and send UN troops to fight against the aggressors. He also ordered General MacArthur's Japan-based troops into Korea. General MacArthur landed a brilliant invasion behind enemy forces at Incheon on September 15, 1950, and drove the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel towards China and the Yalu River. An overconfident MacArthur boasted that he'd have the boys home by Christmas. In November 1950, Chinese volunteers flooded across the border and pushed South Koreans back to the 38th parallel. MacArthur, humiliated, wanted to blockade China and bomb Manchuria, but Truman didn't want to enlarge the war beyond necessity. The angry general began to publicly criticize President Truman and spoke of using atomic weapons, and poor Truman had no choice but to remove him from command on the grounds of insubordination. Truman fired MacArthur. MacArthur returned home to cheers, while Truman was scorned as a pig, an imbecile, an appeaser to Communist Russia and China, and a Judas. In July of 1951, truce discussions began, but immediately snagged over the issue of prisoner exchange. Talks dragged on for 2 more years as men continued to die. And we'll continue to discuss the North Korean and South Korean positions in North Korea in our classroom discussions. This is the works cited page. The images used in this presentation are taken from the public domain.